Welcome. Before we start, one housekeeping item. We're going to have a question and answer period. And I know a lot of you are using the apps, but if anyone wants to use a note card and a pencil, please raise your hand. Our producer in the back will pass them out. Wonderful. Welcome. Thursday, April 12th, 3:30 p.m. We're all here for panel number 4312, Congress is Broken. My wife was very enamored by the fact that wasn't even a question mark. It was a statement. So before we start, for those of you who don't know me, I'm T.J. Hyman. And actually, for those of you who do know me, I'm still T.J. Hyman. But more importantly, the gentleman we're going to be talking to, I had the privilege of breaking bread with them yesterday. Learned, interesting, funny. They're going to do a great job for you today. First of all, in the middle, we'll start with Michael Frank. He's a member of the Hoover's Institute in Washington, D.C. He served as a policy director for House Majority Leader Kevin McCarthy, and he worked at the Heritage Foundation. More importantly, if you find this interesting, your best chance of getting the real scoop is buying him a glass of red Zinfandel after this is over. On my left is Robert George, who's an editorial member of the New York Daily News. He's written for the National Review, the New Republic. He grew up in Trinidad. And if you find what he says fascinating, the best way to get the real deal from him is with a six-pack of Goose Island IPA. Last but not least is Ian Millhiser. He's a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, and he's clerked for the U.S. Court of Appeals. He was on the Duke Law Journal. And if you really, really want to hear what's rocking his world, buy him an old-fashioned.
Rye old-fashioned, ideally.
So with that, we're going to have opening statements. Congress is broken. I'm going to open it up to you. Go get them, Rob.
All righty, there we go. Knocking myself over here. A slight correction on my bio. Actually, I was born in Trinidad, but I was only a year old before I left. So I ended up growing up in the UK and the US. However, true to my Caribbean heritage, if you really want to reward me after this, instead of a six-pack of Goose Island IPA, you can perhaps find something that is legal here, but not necessarily everywhere else in the country. With that said, so we have this topic of Congress is broken. And I think I would like to begin by paraphrasing Shakespeare and saying, well, and slightly modifying the title and saying, how is Congress broken? Let me count the ways. Actually, in a sense, that's kind of the real theme of this panel, because I think my colleagues will have any number of examples of the brokenness of Congress. When we were actually having lunch with our esteemed moderator yesterday, I was sort of taking a skeptical position of whether Congress is actually broken, because frankly, the Constitution is a fascinating, complex document that is actually designed to make it very difficult to pass laws. So it's something built into the system. But even under that rubric, we start noticing that things are not working the way they should. Now, it's quite easy to point to a certain gentleman who happens to be in the White House to contributing to some of the chaos that we see in Washington, D.C. But the facts are that the brokenness of Congress is something that you can't really blame on Donald Trump, because it's been sort of baked into the cake at minimum 20 years, but actually closer to 40. So if I was to ask this wise and esteemed audience here, how many government shutdowns have there been since 1976? Let's say, let's put it this way. If you think it's 5 or 6, raise your hand. Okay. If you think it's 9 or 10, raise your hand. If you think it's 15 to 20, raise your hand. You would all be, the latter crew would be correct. There have been 20 variations of government shutdowns since 1976. And first was there was one under Gerald Ford. There were 5 under Jimmy Carter. And the Jimmy Carter shutdowns are notable because the Democrats controlled both the House and the Senate. However, the government shut down. There were 8 under Reagan when we had divided government, 1 under George H.W. Bush, 2 very notable and sustained ones under Bill Clinton. George W. Bush, for all of his various faults and the criticism pushed against him, there were no government shutdowns under the Bush administration, and that included 2 years when the Democrats had taken control. 1 under President Obama, and two already under President Trump. I raise this because the 1976 date is significant because that was the beginning of the current budget processing system, and that was created because there was a budget standoff between the Democratic Congress and President Nixon. The Congress, under the old rules, had allocated certain funds, and President Nixon declined to actually spend those. And so, coming from that conflict, the Congress, when the Democrats came in, they decided to change everything. I think it's fair for us to ask how successful they were, given the regular entrenched chaos we have on the budgeting side. Which, if you read your Constitution, one of the main responsibilities, if not the main responsibility, of Congress is laying down taxes and spending our resources, spending our financial resources, and that does not happen in any kind of. It rarely happens in any kind of regular order, where the House and the Senate pass budgets. They go through, and you have a series of spending bills that are supposed to be passed in regular order. Instead, what we have are multiple continuing resolutions. I believe we've basically had it's maybe 4 years over the course of 4 decades that we've actually had regular order where the budgets have passed and the appropriations have been passed in an appropriate and timely fashion. The upshot of that is that there's no real serious oversight on the spending process. On the Hill, and Michael can speak to this afterwards, we no longer refer to what are called omnibus bills. They are indeed ominous. They are ominous because rather than Congress actually looking to see how certain money is supposed to go to certain agencies and saying maybe take a little from this agency, maybe put it over there, make reasoned and smart decisions on how our money is spent, because you have a year-to-year chaotic approach to how money is being spent. You get to the crisis point, and the only way to resolve the crisis is to just squish everything into one bill and get it pushed through. For those of us who believe in, quote, limited government and fiscal probity, this becomes an annual nightmare. And so you end up with situations like Paul Ryan, who has had a reputation and had a belief in the idea of fiscal responsibility and trying to, at some point, get to a balanced budget, ends up overseeing a 1.5 trillion dollar, always go high, $1.5 trillion dollar budget. And in that, of course, we can also debate the tax cuts and things like that. But that's a slightly different story. Also, part of this over the last few years is the addition of the debt limit into the budget process, which adds yet another level of crisis level financial planning for our esteemed government. Now, as we were talking yesterday, TJ asked, well, do we have solutions? Both.
One thing, in all fairness, I was thought maybe we'd do solutions at the end. But
well,
you go ahead.
No.
You're on a roll.
Well, the only reason I just kind of bring that up now, both as you find out, Ian and Michael are both a lot smarter in terms of burrowing down into the minutiae of policy on some of the
big words
on some of these things. So I will allow them to really plunge in onto the solution side. I'm a journalist. I will confess I did work in Washington, D.C. 20 years ago, and so I'm partly responsible for some of the mess that we're in right now. But that said, I'm sadly somewhat pessimistic on this because for other reasons, which you'll also hear, the system really is broken. One of the things we can at least think about, and something we'll also talk about, though, is going back to the 1976 Budget Reconciliation Act and seeing if there are ways to maybe from the very beginning get the White House and Congress talking at the very start of the process to try and figure out at least some mutual ground in terms of a sense of what our expenditures are, what our tax revenue is, and so forth, so we don't have to go through this annual insanity and this basic annual fiscal insanity. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Michael.
Thanks, TJ. How's everyone doing? You happy? Is it on? It should be on, right?
It's ironic that Michael's mic isn't.
Mike's mic is not on.
Yeah.
All right.
That's known as a mic drop.
Test.
All right. Now I'm ready, right? Okay. Okay.
More the merrier.
All right.
The system is broken and it's CWA.
Is Congress broken? I'll ask it as a question, and I'll say generally yes. Robert makes a lot of good points. Let me maybe go in a little deeper in some of these elements. I think part of what's wrong is structural in nature, meaning that as we have created Congress under our Constitution, we gave it certain authorities. We divided those authorities between House and Senate. We, most importantly, gave Congress it made it the place to raise revenue and spend it. And in the House especially is the starting point of that, because the House was viewed by the founders as, because they're elected every 2 years, as being closer to the people. And the founders were really afraid and recognized of the power of raising revenue, power to taxes, the power to destroy, and the power to spend that revenue. So they wanted it to be vested in where the part of the government that was closest to the average citizen. The Senate has obviously the treaty authorities and the confirmation powers and so on. And a lot of those authorities have been allowed to ebb away, and some of that is intentional. For example, if you look at the resources that Congress has made available to itself in order to carry out those responsibilities, there's been a big decline in the last 36 plus years. The example, which I hope I haven't used too many times this week, but is really important, I think, is that when you look at things like staff, in year 1980, in the House, for example, there were roughly 2,000 professional committee staff, the people who really make the institution function at a technical level. They're the people you go to ask if this wild idea you had after the softball game the night before is viable. They're the people that write the reports. They're the people that pull together hearings and make them come about. And they have the answers to questions on the areas in which they're expert. 2000 and 1980, in 2016, 36 years later, that was down to under 1,200. Okay? And during those years, things got more complicated. The tax code was more complicated. The entitlement programs grew arms and legs and new appendages of new programmatic activity. You had just about every policy area became more challenging. The appropriations that the appropriating committee staff had to deal with went up by leaps and bounds, multiples of where it was in 1980. 96 professional committee staff on the Ways and Means Committee, both minority and majority. In 1980, 60 now. That's both majority and minority. Did a big tax bill. How many pages are in the tax code? How many pages of tax regulations are there? How many entities are affected directly by what they were doing? And they didn't have that many people doing it. We take staff out to California a lot, to Stanford, where Hoover's mothership is located. And last summer we had this top Democratic staffer for the Ways and Means Committee who handled tax policy. And wonderful woman, but stressed and stretched out, just given how much responsibility she had, and it was her and maybe one other person. That's a problem. If you're trying to be a co-equal branch of government, and I want to use that word a lot now, co-equal, which is what the founders intended, you can't do it when you have one or two people handling all the work for the members on the core committee of jurisdiction on a big important policy area. So that's a problem. The average congressional district in 1980 compared to now is about 200,000+ more constituents per district than there used to be. That's a lot of casework. That's a lot of of responsibilities, and the budgets have been frozen. The staff number of staff is the same. Members of Congress get paid at a level they've been paid at for about the last 10, 12 years. They sleep in their offices because they can't afford to get places in D.C. They live probably lower level of life than a college student does, and their staff usually live better quality lives than they do. So the institution is sort of draining itself of the kind of tools you need. You can't conduct oversight if you don't have enough oversight staff. You can't rely. You don't want to have to rely on outside expertise to do your job for you. So that's part of the problem. Another part of the problem is something that was pointed out by a couple of law professors in a 2006 article. I think they were both NYU professors, and I think it was the Harvard Law Journal, called Separation of Parties, Not of Powers. And what they did, I thought it was magnificent. It's a long one, about 90 or 100 pages long, so it was borderline a book. Wonderful summary and anecdotes and statistical data on how there's been more of an alignment, and this is 2006, remember, between members of Article 1, the leadership in the House and Senate, and a president of the same party. And they kind of cross over each other in terms of the boundaries between Article 1 and Article 2. So it used to be, you'd always use someone like Robert Byrd, the former senator from West Virginia, as an example of someone who was an institutionalist, in a sense. U.S. senator, loved the institution of the Senate, and thought of himself first and foremost as a senator, not as a Democrat. And he oftentimes would go to the floor and do things that would annoy partisans in his own party because he was upholding the role of the Senate in some debate, and he felt it was being intruded upon. That gave way to these alliances that crossed the party lines, where senators and leaders of the House and Senate would voluntarily give back their constitutional authority to be a co-equal branch to the executive branch. One example was, I'll pick on Republicans because I know that's going to get me at least one applause line this week. I haven't got any applause lines yet. I just want one. And when Denny Hastert was Speaker in the early 2000s, he had a rule that he would not bring a bill to the floor. There were two criteria. It had to be a majority of the majority would have to be in favor of it, meaning a majority of Republicans would have to support whatever the bill was. But more importantly, he said, and I heard this in internal meetings at the time, he did not, we would never bring a bill to the floor if the president was, meaning George W. Bush, would veto it. So all the negotiations that would normally be between the two branches occurred before the bill ever saw the light of day to go to the floor, to guarantee that he felt he would fail his own president if he sent a bill to the floor that the president felt the need to veto. And indeed, I think the president vetoed like one bill. It was a campaign finance bill somewhere in mid part of his second term. So that's an example where if you're a member of the House and you have honorable differences with the president, your own leader is not allowing your institution to behave like it should. Fast forward, and you're looking at times where when Senator Reid was leader of the Senate, now I'll pick on a Democrat, what he did to move nominations through, for example, he bent the rules to what he did procedurally to kill debates in bills, right? He would fill up the amendment tree to preclude amendments on the floor of the Senate and then call for a cloture vote. And if a member of the Senate wanted to have their voice heard through the mechanism of offering an amendment, they had to basically conduct a filibuster with colleagues to try to get a chance to offer an amendment. And the irony is, I think it was in the 2014 election cycle, a couple of senators, I think one was here in Colorado when Cory Gardner won, the other one was in Alaska, they were hammered in campaign ads for having been in the Senate for 6 years and never once having had an amendment. Well, the reason was Senator Reid was trying to protect those same senators from quote-unquote tough Republican votes, so he shut things down institutionally and denied the Senate a chance to air everything, and he did that in coordination with the executive branch later, when it was President Obama, in ways that would have, had Senator Byrd rolling over in his grave. So there's a lot of these things that are resource-based and structurally based, and in a way partisan-based, a new sense of you wearing your partisan hat ahead of your institutional constitutional hat, that I think has caused the institution of Congress to be degraded. And there's other things relating to this that get to the regulatory process giving the executive branch agencies precedence through something called the Chevron rule and some cases that followed it, where the courts have instructed the judges in the lower courts, as the Supreme Court did this, to give great deference to the expertise in the executive branch agencies, and any interpretation of the federal law would have to be deferred to by the courts unless the exercise of that was arbitrary and capricious, which is a tough standard to reach. And there's subsequent cases that said that's even true of interpreting when an administrative judge interprets a regulatory language. So they've basically given the executive branch carte blanche to, in some ways, write the laws. And a lot of authority has been concentrated there. Executive authority, judicial authority through administrative judges, and the legislative authority in this great power to interpret what the words really mean. So I think the separation of our branches of government have gotten out of whack in ways that have degraded our ability to get things done and conduct the kind of debates that were envisioned under all these different wonderful checks and balances we have. I'll stop there. Look forward to your questions.
Ian.
All right. I actually agree with a surprising amount of what Michael said, although I'm in the position of being the guy who argues that the separation of powers are bad. So here we go. The way that we make laws in this country, the way that our legislature is set up, is very unusual compared to our peer nations. We have an unusual amount of veto points, meaning that there are a surprising number of places where a bill that enjoys majority support in both houses of Congress can get stopped. So one way that it can get stopped is we have the unusual feature of strong bicameralism. Having two legislative bodies that both have to agree on a bill is actually very uncommon in our peer democracies. You do have other countries that have upper houses, like the British House of Lords, but they are typically subordinate players. So, for example, in England, the House of Lords can reject a bill 3 times, but if the House of Commons passes it the 4th time, it is law. So bicameralism is very unusual. We also, in addition to having bicameralism, do it in a really immoral way. The idea that someone in Wyoming should have 67 times as much representation as a person in California should offend you. You know, we've been swimming in this fact for so long that I think we don't pause to think about how odd that is that we say that some American citizens should have more of a voice in their government than others. And in addition to being structured in a very unusual way, the Senate has the filibuster, which makes it even harder to get a bill through, and potentially allows a block of senators who represent as little as 30% of the population to prevent a bill from moving forward. In addition to that, you have a president, and that is actually also very unusual. So most of our peer democracies are what are called parliamentary democracies, and what that means is that the people elect the legislature, and the legislature chooses the chief executive. And there are a number of advantages to having a prime minister over a president. First of all, it avoids government shutdowns for the most part. The reason we've had the shutdowns that Robert talked about is because in the United States, two warring factions can each control at least one veto point, and so you can't agree on must-pass legislation, and so nothing passes. That's not going to happen in Britain, where the Tories control the government, or in Canada, where the Liberals control the government, because you don't have warring factions. And also, in the event that you can't pass a budget, one mechanism you frequently see in parliamentary democracies is that a new election is immediately called. So the party in the majority has a tremendous incentive not to get hung up on small things, because if they do, they risk losing their majority. Parliamentary democracies also provide much more feedback to voters. So one problem that we had for the entire Obama administration is the Republicans will say, well, Obama is providing bad governance, and that's why the recovery isn't strong enough. And the White House would say, well, Republicans in Congress keep stopping us from doing the things that we want to do, and that's why the recovery hasn't been strong enough. And it's unless you're an extraordinarily sophisticated observer with degrees in economics and law, it is very difficult to tell who is telling the truth, or if either of them are telling the truth. In Canada, if something goes wrong, you know it's the Liberal Party's fault. And if something goes right, you know to...
in all fairness, in Boulder, we always know it's the Republican Party's
Of course.
fault. Okay.
And in addition to that, if things are going well under Prime Minister Trudeau, you know who to vote for in the next election. So you get much more feedback as to how your government is doing when you have a system that preferences alternating, having one party take one term governing and then another party takes a turn governing, as opposed to having the system that we have where you just have different parties controlling different veto points and nothing happens. Another advantage of the parliamentary system is it denuclearizes the question of whether you should remove the chief executive. So impeachment is considered an extraordinary step in the United States, and a big reason why is because the legislature is not normally in the business of picking who the executive is. So that means that if you have an incompetent president, or a president who's engaged in some sort of malfeasance, or a president who seems to be self-dealing, or a president that, for some reason you think might not be up to the job, in the United States, it is an extraordinary event to remove that person, and it is also extraordinarily damaging for that president's party. Compare that to what happened in Great Britain in 1990 when the Tories controlled a majority in Parliament. Margaret Thatcher was becoming increasingly unpopular, and they wound up replacing her with John Major, and then going on to win another election, and John Major was president for 7 years. And I say that not to endorse Tory rule, just to point out that it is a good thing that the Tory party felt like, when they felt like they needed to replace their leader, they felt like they could do so without facing nuclear political consequences, and so they had to be yoked to this person that they no longer felt was fit to govern the country. There's one more big advantage I want to list in not having all those veto points. It avoids military coups. So there's a political scientist late political scientist named Juan Lintz. I was at Yale for many years, primarily studied Latin America. And one reason why the parliamentary system has thrived and the presidential system has not done so well is because presidential democracies tend to fall in coups. And the reason they tend to fall in coups is very simple. It's that something happens a lot like what happened in 2011 in the United States. You have one party that controls the House of the legislature. They don't want to pass a budget that the president is willing to sign, and you have a prolonged period of nothing happening. And eventually, someone says, "Well, someone's got to be in charge," and the people with the power to seize power is the military. And so, while it has not happened, there's actually an entire subfield of political science exploring why the United States has managed to keep a presidential democracy this long. I have thoughts on that. The short answer actually is racism. Okay, maybe I should flesh that out a bit. The slightly longer answer is that in the United States for many years, intractable divides were on racial questions. And while it is a moral abomination if you don't have a robust civil rights regime, it's not an existential threat to your country because, the trains keep running and the government workers still keep getting paid. Now our intractable divides are on fiscal lines. And that is an existential threat to your nation because if you can't fund the government or pay off your debt or, keep raising your debt ceiling, then your nation will eventually cease to exist. But anyways, my point is we have too many veto points. Our Congress is broken because Congress was broken by design. And we have now entered an era of very sorted political parties, meaning that the most liberal Republican consistently votes well to the right of the most conservative Democrat and vice versa. And so our system was not set up to have strong political parties with very deep divides along fiscal lines and also have all these veto points kicking around.
These are all great points. So I'm going to sort of call an audible here for a second. I am just overwhelmed with the quality of the questions I'm getting. The quality of these questions are unbelievably good. One thing I'm going to just take a little pivot here. What we've talked about from all three of you is structural issues. Democracy, we were one of the first democracies. The parliamentary government democracies got to see what we did wrong and build upon it.
That's exactly right. That is why. I mean, they learned from our mistakes.
One thing, a lot of these questions are talking not about structural issues, but some cultural issues. And do you mind if we can ask a few questions and sort of dive into the cultural issues? So my tongue was firmly planted in my cheek when I said, in Boulder, we know it's the Republicans' fault. I'm an independent, but that gets to something that's very, very real, tribalism. And can you each speak maybe 1 or 2 minutes on tribalism and the cultural effects on what? Go ahead.
As my colleagues were speaking, actually, it occurred to me that all three of us looked at the brokenness of Congress from the inside out, looking at, say, from the budget, the budget process. Or the basic structure of how Congress was created under the Constitution, as Ian pointed out, and some of the other elements of what has happened with congressional leaders and the decisions that they have made. Part of the problem of the brokenness, though, is you have to look at it from the outside in. And as the question there, I guess I think is kind of hinting at. We have been building for several decades a more tribalistic kind of politics. So, in addition to what Ian pointed out about how the most liberal Republican is well to the right of the most conservative Democrat and so forth, you also have a situation where in decades past, you were able to create, geographical coalitions where Republicans in the Northeast were able to work with Democrats in the Northeast because there were certain geographic sensibilities that bond them together. Over the last 4 or 5 decades, there's been this kind of a sorting on geographic and cultural lines. I think one of the earliest flashpoints of that, and of which there have been reverberations for 30 years now, was the Supreme Court nomination of Robert Bork. Bork was rejected, and that became something of a seminal point for Republicans, because Republicans believed that coming just 15, 16 years after Roe v. Wade, that Democrats would stop at nothing on Supreme Court nominations. And so the Republicans decided that they would also stop at nothing on Supreme Court nominations. And so since 1987, just about every Supreme Court nomination is basically a declaration of war for whichever side sees one of their judicial spots being threatened. And every time you have a new nomination, it enhances the tribal sensibilities within both parties' base. And that basically has caused every Supreme Court nomination to be broken from the moment that it occurs.
The tribal question is a good one. There's a professor at Harvard, Amy Chua, wrote a book called Political Tribes, just came out recently. We did a book event for her. It's interesting in that she does it not just in the United States, but looks at it, some of these trends internationally. But one thought, to go back to Congress for a second here, is that a lot of Congress now is organized around caucuses, and the caucuses, usually behind the scenes, exert an enormous amount of power in the legislative dance, whether it's to bring bills to the floor, whether it's to create a uniform party position on something, those kind of things. Even getting members who are newly elected onto committees that they're seeking and lobbying for that as a group. So the Democrats tend to have more identity-based groups. They have the Black Caucus, Hispanic Caucus, Women's Caucus, but they also have a Progressive Caucus. They have, they used to have the Blue Dogs. They still kind of technically do, but they're very few in number now. On the Republican side, there's the Freedom Caucus, which gets a lot of attention, about 30, 35 House members who are very far on the right. And then you have the Republican Study Committee, and you have the Tuesday group, which are the moderates. The Tuesday group are probably 20 to 30 moderate Republican members. Behind the scenes, they're really important. The leadership of both of the majority and the minority have to figure out where each of these caucuses are on important issues before they can really start making strategic judgment calls about where to go. My suspicion is that in some time in the distant future, when political scientists looking for a thesis topic in a grad school is going to say, well, maybe there was actually multiple parties, more than two, meaning more than two parties at work in the Congresses of this era. And they may find ways to look at how the caucuses emerged, how they matured and grew and learned sophisticated techniques to exert their collective sense of what they want to see done. The Senate is a little less that way because of the nature of the Senate. They're much more, they all joke every senator wakes up every morning and looks in the mirror and sees a future president, right? And there's a lot of truth to that. So it's harder to get them to work in groups than it is in the House. House is like a bunch of, it's literally tribes, or maybe street gangs is a better term of art. But it is true, and I think it's much more pronounced now than it used to be. And Robert's correct that there used to be more geographically based ways of sorting, and they crossed party lines. So there was, it was more democratic, but there was a Northeast Midwest coalition, which was like a study group back in the day in the 70s and 80s. And they looked at things like water issues, like the Great Lakes issues, stuff like that. And there was members of both parties that coordinate with each other to try to advance the regional interest. And maybe that was because in those times there was many more of these bills were moving that were truly kind of regional. They had formulas. If it was an agriculture bill, it still to some extent works this way in that world. But you had these geographic areas built around crops and commodity categories. You had highway and transportation type bills that were built around, giving money to certain metro mass transit systems. So all the members that had big public transit systems in their districts would collaborate, and that would cross party lines as well, much more so than it does today. But the tribal thing is really important to understand how the day-to-day process works in both the House and the Senate.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with more or less everything they said about how the
Can I amend what I just said?
about how the facts that the parties have sorted is really important here.
Yeah.
So it used to be the case that both the most liberal and the most conservative members of Congress would have identified as Democrats, and that is no longer the case. It used to, you had a whole block of progressive Republicans that backed the New Deal and that backed the Civil Rights Act, and like that block basically doesn't exist. So like as a descriptive matter, like as our parties have sorted, we've become more vulnerable to the problems that I guess I described in my opening. And I guess like that goes to a certain extent why I think certainly I did, and I suspect why my colleagues also led with structural concerns, which is to a certain extent, I think we have to understand what government is capable of doing. So government is not capable of making people like each other. It's not capable of making people who identify as who are conservative decide that they want to identify as Democrats, and people who are liberal deciding they want to identify as Republicans so that we can form better ad hoc coalitions. Like that's just not something in the government's power to do. But it is in the government's power to decide how it structures the legislature. And even, without engaging in, doing things that would require a constitutional amendment, it was within the government's power to make sub-constitutional reforms that I think ease the passage of bills and make it easier for Congress to function. So, I'm at least going to tend to focus on structural concerns because I think those are the things that can actually be fixed. I don't know, like, what a policy portfolio would look like to just get people to get along.
Since we are talking about Congress, I think it is just important to stress the word we are using is S-O-R-T-E-D and not S-O-R-D-I-D.
Speaking of that first word that Robert just spelled out, when I was working on the Hill most recently, and there would be some situation, my boss was a whip, the majority whip when I first started with him, and he became the leader in the course of my employment there. You'd be looking at a potential head count for a vote, and out of the blue, you'd find out that guys from the Freedom Caucus would be raising concerns that no one had really seen coming, and all of a sudden, the vote count on your rule, which is you have to vote for a rule to get a bill to the floor, and you need every minority party member always votes against the majority party's rule. It's just a tradition. So you always have to get your 218 votes out of your own caucus. So if you get a handful of members starting to rebel and you have a narrow majority anyway, you have to figure out what they're concerned about. And the common expression was, "Oh my gosh, our right hand doesn't know what our far right hand is doing," And that's it. There were no liberals, really true liberals, in the Republican conference.
Let me rip off.
No, I was just going to say, just comparing to what Ian was saying about the a parliamentary process versus what we have here. The collapse of a rule being voted down is the closest we actually get to a confidence vote failure in the House. And in fact, if you go back to 1994. The beginning of the handwriting on the wall of the end of the 40-year dominance of Democrats in the House was the collapse of the rule on the crime bill, and you had the situation where conservative Republicans voted against it because that's what they would do, but there was this split within the Democrats where the Congressional Black Caucus felt that the bill was too harsh, was too onerous, and they ended up voting with the Republicans. The rule collapsed, and it started to it basically fed into what Republicans have been saying, was that the Democrats have become unresponsive and incompetent and any other adjective you wanted, and that started the sort of the ripple effect that helped the Democrats lose the Congress in '94.
So I want to riff off what you said about, I guess, how you suddenly have these spontaneous campaigns blasting members of Congress telling them to vote a certain way. So, like, 30 years ago, if you managed to get 1,000 calls to a member of Congress in a quick order on a particular issue, that was an extraordinary event. And what made it extraordinary is that if 1,000 people started bombarding a member of Congress, what it communicated to that member of Congress is, wow. First of all, there must be a lot of other people who feel this way that I'm not hearing from, because you have to have a huge pool of people who think this way to get that many to make that call. And second of all, they must be really, really organized. So if I'm going to do what they don't want me to do, I better be really, really sure of it. And, if the person's on the fence, they're probably going to not do it. Now there are probably dozens of organizations that whenever they want can send a single email and get 1,000 calls, angry calls sent to a member of Congress. And the members haven't yet recalibrated what it means when that happens now. And so, they tend to overreact. The other thing is that the asks are so much more, the asks coming from the groups are so much more sophisticated. So, 40 years ago, or maybe 30 years ago, so I could pick a time when I think it was actually in Congress, if there was a bill that was a good bill but was bad for coal miners, Senator Rockefeller, who was the senator from West Virginia, could vote against the bill. And then but then he could go back to his constituents and say, hey, look, I voted against it. I did everything I could, and the bill would still become law because there's a majority of the Senate who supported it. Now the groups that don't want the bill can send emails, demand that Senator Rockefeller filibuster the bill. Demand that Senator Rockefeller insist that the bill be read on the floor. Demand that Senator Rockefeller insist that that the committee markup be held over for 1 week. Demand that Senator Rockefeller insist that no committee hearings be held after 2 p.m. All of these, by the way, are things that a single senator has the power to do. And if Senator Rockefeller doesn't demand that no committee hearings are held over or are held after 2 p.m., then they blast then they blast him with more emails, and there's ads, and his opponent picks up on the attack. And this just wasn't the case before. So you have Senate rules, which themselves add a crazy number of, if not veto points, delay points into the system, and you have extraordinarily sophisticated advocates that literally, with 30 minutes worth of work, can get 1,000 people to call up a senator and say, hey, you better make sure that the nomination for what's her name, Wendy Vitter, is the latest controversial judicial nominee, that the nomination for Wendy Vitter is held over for an extra week in the Senate Judiciary Committee before they vote on whether to move her onto the floor. And I don't understand how you legislate in such an environment where you could suddenly bombarded with demands to use the most the minutia of procedure in order to prevent something from happening
as a weapon.
Yeah,
and that's a good point. Excuse me, but it can be even worse than that when the instructions given to the 1,000 people who make the phone calls are a little bit off and are technically impossible to execute. And the staff is on the phone saying, but ma'am, we can't do that. What do you mean you can't do that? And therefore you have 1,000 people who are even angrier than they otherwise would be. So they have to get the remedy correct. I've been there.
Well, good. There's a lot of questions here, and again, a lot of really, really good questions. They're talking about campaign dollars, the influence. So I'm going to throw this out in two parts. Where do you see money causing the problem? And optimistically, is there a fix?
I guess I'll jump in. So, I do think there are some problems with, members of Congress getting bought, but I think that's very far from the worst problem you have with campaign finance. So the problem you have with campaign finance is if you go out the back door of the Capitol and you walk down a hill and there's two houses, they look like just big houses there. One of them's owned by the DNC, one of them's owned by the RNC. And on the third floor of both of those buildings, there are lines and lines of tables and lines of telephones. And if you are a member of Congress, you will spend about 4 hours a day when you are in Washington sitting at one of those tables dialing.
Actually, on the Republican side, it's in the basement, actually.
Okay, good to know. On the Democratic side, it's on the third floor, I believe. So you'll spend about 4 hours a day dialing for dollars. Hello, rich person that I don't know. I'm your congressman, and I would like you to give me $2,500. And there are problems with this in the sense that this means they're hearing a lot more of the concerns of rich people than they're hearing the concerns of other people. But the biggest problem, I think, bigger than the corruption, is that if you're spending 4 hours a day doing that, you're not learning about the bills you're voting on. You're not developing any knowledge of, what your constituents are looking for. You're not building coalitions. You're not meeting with people who actually have useful information for you. You're just wasting this time raising money, and you're not going to know anything. And I'm flabbergasted every time I talk to most members of Congress at how little they know. And it's not their fault. It's because they don't have the time to know anything.
Or the staff.
Yeah. So the question is, what can we do about it? I mean, unfortunately, there are some things we can do around the margins with public financing, but realistically, given the regime that the Supreme Court handed down for us, the only thing we can do is get a better Supreme Court. Because as long as you have precedents, not just like Citizens United, but McCutcheon, which legalizes various forms of money laundering in the campaign finance context, and another case, other cases dealing with extremely wealthy candidates, or dealing with what happens when a super PAC moves in and drops $5 million, and the state wants to give someone defensive dollars, so that they aren't nuked by that super PAC. There are a lot of things that could be done to solve this problem, but the Supreme Court won't let us.
To follow up on that, the other area where money has a great impact in this process actually touches upon what Ian was discussing before. All of those phone calls and emails and so forth, urging, tell your senator to do X or tell your congressman to do Y. One of the reasons why Congress or our politics is broken, actually, is that at one time the parties had a real control on how money was going to candidates, and when the parties had that greater control, they in a sense could sort of force candidates, whether they were elected or whether they were challengers, to act in what could be considered a responsible manner. Now, and it's not just Citizens United. It really arguably goes back to Buckley versus Vallejo after Watergate. Outside interests, outside organizations have a far greater influence on energizing the various base to come out against certain bills or against certain appointments and so forth. And the members now react to that, whereas at one time they would be reacting to the leaders within their given committee or caucus, or to members of the party. And so the outside, that's really one of the areas where the outside money really has a major influence. It's not so much going to a specific campaign, but organizing activists to act on certain bills and so forth.
Michael?
I think for the most part, when an issue is somewhat mature and all the affected parties and interest groups are aware of the proposal and what it might do, and they haven't had a chance to analyze it, they can cancel each other out. You can bring a lot of resources to bear on both sides of almost all issues. But one example I was involved with was there was a bill called the Innovation Act, and it was about 4 years ago now, and it's a bill relating to patent trolls. Have you heard of that? They're firms that go up and buy kind of unused patents and then that are relatively close in design and function to things that are already up and running, and they will then file letters telling small business people that you can't play music in your shop, for example, unless you give us X number of $1,000 because we have the patent for that kind of technology and you're violating. But in fact, there's another patent that they're working under anyway. And it's an abusive system, and there's a bill moving forward to try to address that. And for some reason, the only side of the issue that seemed to be aware of the whole process and that had weighed in were the people that wanted to stomp out the patent trolls, which tended to be large, a lot of them were tech firms, that wanted to get free use of patents, and they wanted to stomp on small inventors and crowd them out. And at some point, the small inventors and some of the other firms that somehow were aligned with them woke up. But in the interim, the bill had gone through the Judiciary Committee with a very large bipartisan margin and all kinds of glowing statements. There were reports from the White House basically saying good things about the concept. And there was no other competing documentation or studies or arguments out there, and it actually went to the floor of the House and passed with some huge. It was toward the end of I guess it was 2014, big margin, like almost 300 votes, and we all thought we had done our job real well. And then the people on the other side of the issue woke up and started putting a lot of resources and money into counteracting what had just been done. The bill had died; it didn't go to the Senate anyway. So for the next Congress, all of a sudden, there's more of a level playing field, and members who had voted a certain way in 2014 were starting to regret it because they were learning more about it. And that's part of the, that's a good part of the process where the outside affected parties come in and educate members and staff about the pros and the cons. It's up to the members and the staff to be able to sift through the information and disregard some of the things that are purely kind of either overstatements or partisan or whatever, and try to get to the nuggets and take advantage of the fact that other people have spent a lot of time and resources figuring things out. But then that bill in the next Congress didn't go anywhere because of the competing and massive amounts of lobbying and money going into both sides of that issue, and it's been at a sort of at a stall ever since. It's probably not going to go anywhere anytime soon.
So I'm going to take a little pivot here once again. You guys have been answering greatly. The questions are awesome. I'm going to take a little break here and read a commercial, and then we're going to have everybody stay here because I'm going to ask you guys to pick one thing that we can do to make it better. And if not that, is there a hope? Is there an organization? Is there an individual? And I'd love you guys to think about that so we can end out on an optimistic, hopeful note. But before we do that, I've been asked to read this. To celebrate CWA's 70th year, we have set a goal to raise $70,000. We're a quarter of the way to our goal, and we would appreciate your support. Any amount helps. You can give by selecting the donate button in your app or visiting the CWA website. So let's try and end on a hopeful note. Checks and balances that were designed in the system seem to be working too well. When we put our, go ahead. You want to start, Ian? Or Mike?
Oh, go ahead.
Just my hopeful side, and I'm trying to calibrate this. I'm not going to argue for changing the Constitution or doing anything very dramatic, and that might take a long time, many years, and probably not happen. But there are some legislative proposals that have been through the House a few times that this new administration supports, ironically, because they involve taking away authorities from the executive branch and giving them back to a Congress that would be more co-equal. And if you're thinking about situational ethics here, think about you're taking away power from the Trump administration and potentially giving it to a newly Democratic House after next November. So maybe you might think about this in a different way than it's been thought of before. But the proposals basically go after the Chevron doctrine and the progeny cases relating to it to take away some of the automatic deference that the courts have demanded be given to the executive branch agencies. So when Congress actually writes a bill, the language is going to be, if it goes to court, interpreted by a judge on the merits, not with these deferential standards. There's another bill called the REINS Act, and the REINS Act is basically a way to give Congress a shot at looking at a major regulation and have to vote on it, both House and send it to the president who signs it like a bill before it takes effect, so that there's a sense of a check on executive branch agencies not avoiding and surmounting or bypassing the will of the House and the Senate when they pass bills and it gives more of a balance there as well. And there's some other things relating to the regulatory process that's been created through the Administrative Procedures Act of 1946 and has not really been addressed in any significant way since 1946, and those kind of changes. I would hope that those can get through, and that there might be, because it's sort of an unnatural act for an executive branch agency to give back powers and authority, that it might stand a chance of getting some bipartisan support in Congress, especially if the members of Congress think this is going to help us. If I'm really confident we're going to take over the House next year or the Senate next year, I want that power. I don't want Trump to have that power. So I'm just playing the kind of a naughty game with you guys right now on that.
Thank you. And Robert, 2 minutes or less, what would you do to fix the whole thing?
90 seconds, Ron.
First of all, I would demand 2 more minutes to revise and extend my remarks.
Out of my hands.
Well, obviously, echoing, I'll echo what Michael said. If we were looking, I know Ian is very skeptical of the system that we have as is now. I still believe in the bicameral, system that we have. One area I would look at, and this speaks to what Michael was speaking about at the very beginning. When you sort of look at the inequity of Congress and specifically the House, the number of congressmen and women that we have in terms of dealing with all the various issues addressing this country, and this may require a constitutional amendment, but something to at least think about is expanding the numbers in the House. So you increase the ability of a specific congressman to have a smaller constituency of people to address, and going with that, of course, is you're going to have to expand the staff as well, and that's something to, but that may be able to allow for newer voices, newer coalitions, and so forth. Also, at the very beginning, I said we need to take a look at the budget process. In that one narrow area, we might be able to resolve some of the dysfunction in Congress.
Thank you.
So I think this is the part where our agreement's going to stop. I generally think that the structural problem that we have is that it's too hard to govern, and so I don't think, for example, that making the entire regulatory process dependent on a dysfunctional Congress approving every regulation that goes through on a tight deadline it would be a step in the right direction. Now, that said, I do think there are a number of things that can be done without a constitutional amendment to make our system work better. You can abolish the filibuster. You can make it easier for a block of House members who add up to a majority to bring a bill to the floor over the Speaker's objections. We've all talked about increasing staff budgets. One other thing I would do is I would create in-house think tanks, a Democratic think tank and a Republican think tank, at Congress for members to access. The advantage of that is that, especially on the House side, a lot of the times these members are being advised by I'm not making this up, by 23-year-olds who have a policy portfolio that has 8 issues in it. And instead of hiring a 23-year-old for each member of the House, you could take that money and hire 30 of the best experts in the country on whatever issues you want them to work on, and you could have those people be the ones advising members of Congress. I would restore a norm that broke down in the 1990s, which is that members of Congress should spend the bulk of their time in D.C. Right now, a member of Congress from Colorado probably spends about 12 hours a week either in an airport or on an airplane, and there's better stuff that they could do with their time so that they could do their job better. And then the last thing I would do, while I think that we're constrained with respect, because of Citizens United and other decisions, with respect to what we can do in the campaign finance space, I think there is some stuff we can do with public financing. I would look to something like Maine's system, where candidates have to raise a threshold number of small dollar donations. And once they clear that threshold, which essentially establishes that they are like a legitimate candidate who has real support, then they get a big lump sum from the state. And in theory, that should be all they can spend.
Well, thank you. If you guys enjoyed this as much as I did, I'd like you to give a big hand for all our panelists. More importantly, if you enjoyed this as much as I did, I'd like you to really consider making a gift for CWA's 70th anniversary. We're around for questions, and you know what beverages they like.
Or non-beverages.
Yeah, enjoyed it.
Thank you.
That was really enjoyable. Thank you so much. But you're right. The problem is checks and balances weren't too well. And we were the first to design it.